as the room fills in, I will start making a short introduction before Isla here goes on with her presentation. So first of all, of course, thank you everyone for making time and to join us today. It's going to be about terrestrial vegetation mostly, definitely terrestrial Arctic systems. And we have the honor of having Dr. Isla Myers-Smith with us. She is this is a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And she, we were discussing this morning, she has 20 years of experience in northern studies, which is scary in many ways, but also places her at a situation in which she has seen a lot of change going on already. So we were also saying that when she started, the tundra was much less green than the tundra is now a couple of decades ago. Isla comes originally from Canada. She did her undergrad at the University of British Columbia, sorry. Then she went up to Alaska University of Alaska Fairbanks to do her master's, moved back to Canada, where she did her PhD at the University of Alberta with David Hicks, and then eventually landed in Scotland, where she has been for the last several years, leading the Team Shrub research group. Everyone working with tundra vegetation probably knows about this group and about Isla's ability to organize large collaborative networks and make people work in as a team across many institutions. She has been working for many years in two field sites in particular in the Yukon, one at the bottom, even though it's a higher elevation in Kluane, and another one at the very top of the Yukon in the coast of the Beaufort Sea, Kiktaruk. And also, I think, Isla, you are currently in charge of another site in the Canadian High Arctic, or you are visiting it?
Just a visitor, yes, but yes.
All right.
We'll hear a bit about that.
So this is Isla. She has worked a lot with spatial and spatiotemporal dynamics of tundra vegetation, working from site-based measurements to remote sensing. And she's going to tell us today about the greening of the tundra and what lies ahead in terms of research and research questions. Thank you for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm imagining the Oxford Polar Forum, and maybe one day we can be in person together again. Thanks again to Mark for inviting, and a lot of what I'm going to be presenting today is that collaborative research. So it's research that many of you on this call are involved with. So I'll pull up my presentation here. And can everyone see the presentation? Thumbs up, excellent, great. So what I'm going to be telling you about today is a bit of a story on my take on this really prominent signal that we're seeing in Arctic ecosystems that we call the greening of the Arctic. And I'm going to focus on different sources of information on why we think the Arctic's greening and what the mechanisms behind that greening might be, and sort of a bit of forward thinking to how can we improve our understanding and make projections of change into the future. So I like to start my presentations with a nice charismatic polar bear shot, because this is the way we often think about change in the Arctic. So you've got these fluffy, white, cute creatures out on this melting sea ice here. And that's how we often think about how the Arctic is vulnerable to change. But in my own research, the focus is more on these fluffy white creatures. So the plants of the Arctic, and in particular, the Eriophorum species that are also responding to this changing Arctic environment. And in this case, at many sites, this species is doing better as the climate warms. So to understand which species are kind of the winners and which species are the losers of climate change and Arctic change in general is one of the major goals of many of our research programs. And to get a bit of an understanding for what I might mean when we talk about Arctic greening, I'm going to give you the satellite perspective first. So this is a video that hopefully comes through the call here, where you can see the planet, and then you can see a change in greenness over time. So I'll just rerun that video. So as we're moving through the years from the 80s to the 90s to now, you see sort of patterns of green across the planet, but particularly in the high latitudes, it's almost as if a light bulb goes on in recent years in these high latitudes. And this is put together from imagery from, in this case, the AVHRR data set of satellite data. And it's showing this prominent greening pattern at high latitudes. And we see that across a variety of different satellite data sets. And then let's visit the tundra itself here with this photograph. So this is my research group's primary field site, Ecological Herschel Island in the Canadian Arctic. It's right on, as Mark pointed out, on the Arctic coast of the Yukon Territory, very close to the border with Alaska, so in the Western Canadian Arctic. And it's a verdant green landscape in the summer. So here's a sort of drone's eye view across some of our focal research sites in the distance. And in the center of the photograph, you can see a little cluster of brown dots. Those are muskox. So you have this heterogeneous terrain where plants are the dominant cover, but there's a lot of other things going on in this image. You can see a retrogressive thaw slump in the background. You can see different microclimates, different hydrology, different plant vegetation communities represented, and all of that is a part of this complex signal of greening. So going back to the satellite data, we have these different types of satellite data sets on different satellite platforms circling the Earth, monitoring tundra ecosystems, and they are all showing a greening. But if you compare 3 different satellite data sets to each other for the same period of time, you see different regional and sort of patterns of that greening signal. So in these maps where you can see green pixels, that's where the tundra greenness is increasing, and where you see brown pixels is where the tundra greenness is decreasing. And where it's gray, there's no directional change. And if you zoom into that Western Arctic region where I do a lot of my work, you can see across the different data sets that there's different patterns of greening. So some show more prominent greening signal than others, and sometimes the greening areas seem to be in different places versus the browning areas. So comparing across data sets, the sort of space or the satellite data sets from space seem to indicate perhaps more complexity than a simple greening story here. And I should point out that the tundra is also browning. So there are places where the greenness signal seems to indicate a decrease in this vegetation index, the normalized difference vegetation index, which is one of the indices you can calculate off of the long-term satellite records that we have available. But if you look at what portion of the Arctic is greening versus browning, the greening signal seems to dominate. So in very recently published analysis of Landsat data, we see about 20% of the Arctic showing a greening signal and only about 4% of the Arctic showing a browning signal. And the remainder of the pixels don't show strong directional trends. So if you look in the literature and you come to some of my talks, you'll get a quite simple story of Arctic greening. So you have climate warming leading to vegetation change, leading to that signal from space of greening around the circumpolar Arctic. But I want to unpack this story here and particularly focus on the links between warming and vegetation change and that vegetation change across scales in this talk. But before I do that, I want to talk about why we should care that the Arctic is greening. And then the primary reason is that these tundra ecosystems, those green plants on the very surface of the tundra landscape, protect a lot of carbon stored and in the frozen permafrost. And so this is a lovely image taken by one of my collaborators, Jeff Kirby, of our Ecological Herschel Island field site. And you can see the permafrost there, that sort of ice that's dark, but it's almost pure water. So it's 90% plus water in the permafrost here. And then intermixed with that ice is organic rich carbon soils. And then on the surface, you can see the active layer. So that part of the soil that thaws each summer and then refreezes in the winter. And on the very surface, you can see the plants themselves. And so I think this image really nicely illustrates that beneath that thin layer of green is a lot of carbon that's currently frozen, but very vulnerable to thaw. And I also want to make the point that a lot of tundra biomass, that green layer, is actually below ground, below that surface. So this is a shrub that we dug up a few years ago with myself and two of my former PhD students. And above ground, this plant was only about 0.5 meter in diameter, but below ground, the roots extended for at least 5 meters in all directions. And so you can see how what's above ground is only the sort of tip of the iceberg plant-wise. And so what all this means is that Arctic ecosystems have these stores of carbon that are very vulnerable to thaw. And if those carbon stores are lost to the atmosphere, it could as much as lead to a doubling of atmospheric CO2. And so that can contribute to large scale feedback. So either through changes in the nutrient cycling and carbon storage, or through reflectance of the system, albedo, so the surface reflectance, how dark the surface of the landscape is. And all of those feedbacks could be positive feedbacks that warm Arctic ecosystems, lead to more vegetation change, and ultimately warm the planet as a whole. So I just wanted to introduce you to where this Qikiqtarjuaq field site is. So here's a map of the globe, and you can see Oxford in the distance there, and in the center here, our Qikiqtarjuaq field site in the Western Canadian Arctic. And if we zoom in a bit here, it's an island off the Arctic coast of the Yukon Territory, right next to the Mackenzie Delta. So in some of my pictures, you'll see a lot of driftwood in the foreground, and that's because we're so close to this Mackenzie Delta region when we're out on the island. And the wood that you see has been transported thousands of kilometers from further south in the boreal forest. And it's sitting right above, so it's above the latitudinal tree line and at that sort of latitudinal tall shrub line. So it's a part of the Arctic, a latitude in the Arctic where we think a lot of change is going on right now. So if you visit the site, this is what you would see as you're flying in. So it's this really ice-rich environment with this heterogeneous terrain and a lot of disturbance going on. So perhaps a place within the Arctic where we might expect rapid change. And if we zoom in onto the ground, this will be the next section of my talk. I'm going to talk about what we're seeing from in situ records at this site and also other sites around the Arctic, and really think about how plants are responding to these changing climate conditions. And I want to make the point that our research on Qikiqtarjuaq is collaborative research. So we're working with local people, including park rangers at the site, to both collect the data, conduct the monitoring, and also interpret and understand those results. So I'm going to start off by talking about plant phenology, so the timing of when plants grow and plants flower and plants senesce their leaves across the season. And one of the ways we've been getting at phenology records at this and many other sites around the Arctic is using time-lapse photography. So this is one of our phenocams at the site. And so we've been currently working, well, we weren't able to get out to the field site this summer. We've been working on compiling some of these data sets, such as the phenocam data, to integrate those into our analyses. And if you take one of the phenocam data sets and make a little time-lapse video of it, this is what it looks like. You can see the plants flowering and growing across the season and then turning yellow at the end of the season. And so these data can really inform our understanding of how things are changing across the landscape in a way that monitoring individual plants isn't quite able to capture. So if we look not just at the Qikiqtarjuaq site, but around the circumpolar Arctic, we see sort of mixed signals of phenology change. At some sites, the phenology is getting earlier, and that's true for both leaf emergence and also flowering. And at other sites, there's not much change, or sometimes the phenology is getting later. And so we're still working on analyzing these cross-site data sets, and there's complexity to unpick here. But part of the reason why we might see this variable amount of phenology change is because there's different drivers of what's controlling phenology at different sites. So we've delved into that a bit at 4 different research sites, which have particularly comparable phenology data. And what we find is a sort of semi-complex signal of climate warming leading to that earlier green up and flowering of plants, but a really important role of snowmelt at the site. So localized snowmelt above the plots controlling how the plants respond. And for most of us who work in polar systems, that's not a surprise. But I think it's important to point out that it's not just the warming itself, it's the warming influencing other elements to the environment that can directly influence the plants. So there are both these direct and indirect mechanisms of change. And the snowmelt part of the story might help to explain why at some sites we don't see the same phenology advance that we see at other sites. And we've been comparing the phenology patterns on the ground with those that you can estimate from satellite data. And at our Qikiqtarjuq field site and at many sites around the Arctic, we see prominent sort of lengthening of the growing season and increase in the peak greenness from various different satellite data sets. But when we compare that to the in situ phenology data, the signals are not always so clear. So, finicky, the changing of slides there. So what we see in these plots, this is again at our Qikiqtarjuq field site, we have earlier phenology on the plot on the left. So the bud burst is happening earlier and the leaves are senescing at the end of the season earlier. And there's no real change in the growing season length if you sort of compare those two lines. But if we look at the MODIS satellite data, we see this lengthening of the growing season by about 20 days. So there seems to be this sort of mismatch between what our in situ records are telling us and what the satellite data indicate for the land surface as a whole. And so one of the things we're working on is trying to unpick why there would be a mismatch at this site and potentially other sites around the circumpolar Arctic. And all of this matters because if we think back to that carbon question, it matters how productivity is changing in these landscapes. So we could pose a bunch of basically hypotheses for how things might be changing as the Arctic greens. So these are not mutually exclusive, but you could have a situation where longer growing seasons are leading to increased plant productivity above ground, below ground. So plants are growing for longer across the entire growing season and there's more growth and that's in their leaves and shoots, but also in their roots. Or you could have a scenario where if growing seasons are getting earlier, that's moving the period of productivity earlier within the season, but perhaps some of the phenology timings are actually quite fixed, and that there might be some evidence that we're seeing at our site because the senescence seems to be getting a little bit earlier as the green up also gets earlier at that site. So we could have a sort of shifting of when growth and productivity is happening within these systems. And then one thing that I'm really interested in, and a bunch of other people around working around the tundra biome, is whether there could be some decoupling or asynchrony between what happens above ground and below ground. And so that you could take either the A or B hypothesis here and sort of play that out if things were happening differentially below ground. So one thing we might see is increased below ground growth as active layers, the sort of thawed part of the top of the surface, get deeper. That's more room for the plants to grow, potentially exposing more nutrients. But you could also see potentially the below ground environment growth continuing into the autumn season as these growing seasons extend, even if the leaves have senesced above ground. So trying to understand these questions and how changes in plant productivity are linking to changes in carbon storage and cycling within these systems is a grand challenge for all of us. So now I want to talk a little bit about plant composition and how that's changing across tundra ecosystems. And a lot of the sort of in situ data come from the International Tundra Experiment Network and the monitoring of meter squared plots like this one here. So this is a photograph from 2019 and we're carrying out the long-term data collection. I'm the person on the iPad there. And this is tedious work, but the data that are produced are really amazing and it can be exploited to levels that we haven't even accessed yet, I would say. But what you have is a non-destructive measure of how plant abundance is changing over time across these plots in permanently marked plots. And that those records are so detailed that you're capturing like every single root or leaf or stem that the pin that drop that you have dropped touches with across these plots and their 100 points of the grid. And what we're seeing at the Qikiqtarjuq site is a signal like this. So this is when I started working at the site. There were 2 years of data. And then over time, we saw a pretty dramatic increase in plant cover and a decrease in bare ground at this site across 2 different vegetation communities at the site. And that kind of change is the same kind of change that we're seeing across the circumpolar Arctic in the monitoring plots across the ITEX network. So we're seeing an increase in most of the functional groups, with particularly the shrubs and the graminoids, so both sedges and grasses increasing, and variable changes in the different flowering plants, and in general, a decrease in mosses and sometimes lichens, and a decrease in bare ground. And if we look at some other properties of how plant composition is changing, such as the thermal niche of the different species, we're seeing an increase in warmer loving species. So that's this signal known as thermophilization. And if we zoom into one of the functional groups, the shrubs, this is the kind of change that we're seeing at least our field site. So these are photographs taken over time at the site and during the period that I've been working there. And you can see visually with your eyes how the shrubs are increasing in this floodplain landscape. And one of the things we're seeing across the ITEX network and the different monitoring data sets is that we have more change happening in the wetter parts of the landscape than the drier parts of the landscape. So this signal has been called shrubification by some, by me and others, and is perhaps one of the sort of more dramatic lines of evidence for a greening signal within the Arctic. And we've been working on compiling the evidence for shrubification for many years now. And we had a paper come out by my PhD student, Mariana Garcia Criado, this February, I think, 2020. And we compared in this study the rates of shrub change, increases in shrub cover in tundra ecosystems and also in savanna ecosystems. And across both of those ecosystems, we see increases in shrubs, about 20 to 30% increase in woody cover over the past half century. And one of the other things that we're interested in doing and have been working on for a while now, and that's how I first met Mark actually, was through a synthesis of growth ring data. So the sort of annual rings that are preserved within woody species in their wood, and using that to get an understanding of how climate sensitive the growth of these tundra shrubs are. And so across that work, we found pretty strong evidence that shrub growth is climate sensitive around the tundra biome. And there's been various follow-up studies and work done on the influence of soil moisture, herbivory, sea ice melt, and snow melt, and how those different factors interact with climate and climate sensitivity of growth of these systems or of these shrubs. And we excitingly had a paper accepted just this morning in PNAS looking at the question of sea ice and how that interacts with these other factors in controlling shrub growth. And so what we're finding across all of those different lines of evidence is that there is a simple signal there of climate warming influencing growth and influencing composition change. But there's also a lot of other factors involved. And at some sites, it could be things like permafrost thaw and the changing below ground and nutrient environment that's really driving the change that we're seeing on the surface. And another sort of angle to the work that we've been doing is thinking about the plant species themselves and the traits that those plants have and how that influences how they respond to changing climate conditions. And so we have, for example, species like Cassiope tetragona, which is sort of grows slow and has a conservative life strategy. And it's doing well as things warm in many Arctic sites. And then we have other species like Senecio congestus, which has a sort of live fast, die young approach to life. And it's also doing well, particularly in areas that are heavily disturbed at Arctic sites. And so if you put all these different pieces of information together, the community composition change and the traits of those species, what we've been finding is that there's a strong gradient in community level height and temperature over space. And then that also translates into a change in community level height over time. So plant communities are getting taller. And it's not just the individual plants growing taller over time. That seems to be going on as well. But it's the tall species that are doing well in these ecological communities as things warm. And an example of that at our Ecological field site is one of the grasses, Alopecuris alpinus, which has really invaded into the long-term monitoring plots since we've begun work at the site. So before the monitoring plots, or in the early days when they were established, the species was completely absent. And since I have worked there, it's come to dominate one of the vegetation types, and is one of the primary species there now. And so I want to go, change our location in the Arctic for a little bit here. So this is up to Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic, so about 1,000 kilometers north of the other field site, much closer to the North Pole. And this is a sort of polar oasis site. So in a much harsher environment, the tundra is a lot less lush. And this is me hiking up next to the glacier. And we've been visiting this and other sites and flying drones over these landscapes to get a cross-scale perspective of change. And so this is flying of one of the drones out on Ellesmere Island, and you get this sort of picture of this less verdant version of a tundra landscape. So for this specific latitude, this is as lush as it gets. And what's exciting about this and many other sites around the Arctic is that there's a long-term experiment going on here. So these are open-top warming chambers, which have been in place for decades across different vegetation communities at this site. And with these open top chambers, we can really look at the experimental effects of warming in these systems. And when we were up in 2018, we brought along a thermal camera, and this is a little video to show you what happens when you put an open top chamber down on the tundra. So there we've added the chamber, and you can start to see the inside the chamber heat up. And then at some point here, we remove the chamber and then it cools down quite quickly. So those open top warming chambers are warming up the tundra by about 1.5 degrees. And another way to think about temperatures within these landscapes is to think about the microclimates in which these plants are growing. And this sort of psychedelic image here is a estimated microclimate using a drone digital surface model for our Ecological site. And you can see colder parts of the microclimate and warmer parts of this landscape. And the plants are growing across this variation in different microclimates. So another sort of key thing that a bunch of us are working on is how the plants are responding not just to the macro scale climate change, but to that micro environment in which they grow. And so working with these data sets, we can look across scales, and these are the data from Ellesmere Island, looking at the landscapes as a whole, those microclimates, the greenness of the vegetation, and then scaling it right down to the sort of plot level. And this is an image with the normalized difference vegetation index, that same index that the satellites that we're using with satellite data to understand greening in the Arctic, but here at the plot scale. And you can see that the open top warming chamber where it has been placed is a lot greener than the surrounding landscape. Though I should say surrounding that chamber is where the ecologists have stood for many years. So we really need to compare this plot to its control plot. So to sort of wrap up the community composition element to this talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about biodiversity changes in these systems, and in particular, this concept that is sometimes called dark diversity. So the biodiversity that's missed by long-term monitoring. So if we look across the different plots in the ITEX network, at the moment, we're not seeing a strong change in biodiversity and species richness. But if anything, we're seeing an increase in richness in these systems. So it does seem at certain sites, like our Ecological site, that there are a few species that are entering into these plots and changing the composition in those plots. But as a whole, we're not seeing a strong directional signal yet. But one of the things is when we're monitoring these plots, we're only monitoring a tiny portion of the overall landscape, and it's just a sample of what's potentially going on. So a bunch of us, led by my PhD student, Gergana Daskalova, set up a protocol to try and capture that sort of diversity that's out there beyond the plots in which we work. So we walked in concentric circles, which you could see in the little time-lapse video there, and marked out all the species that were not found within the long-term monitoring plots, but were found in the adjacent environments. And this is just sort of a schematic of what we found. So there are certain species within these landscapes that are dominant within the plots and found within the plots. And then we found many other species that are very close to those plots, growing in that environment, but not found within the long-term monitoring data. And across the entire network of sites at which we've conducted this protocol, we found on average about 27 species that are adjacent to the plots, but have never been found within the long-term monitoring. So this is the potential future biodiversity that could enter into those plots. And we're working on the analyses right now because we think that this kind of understanding of what species are in the species pool, the potential future biodiversity, will help us make projections of how biodiversity should change in these systems. And one of the things we're really interested in is what microclimates those potential species are growing in right now. So if they're found in the warmer microclimates or the wetter microclimates, that will help us make projections of how biodiversity should shift as the environment changes over time. So for the next section of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about the data collection that we're doing across scales to help inform this understanding of Arctic greening. So now moving up from records at the individual level and the community level up to the landscape. So this is, again, those plots and the long-term monitoring that we're doing at our Ecological site, and then from a drone's eye perspective. And so one of the goals of our research and many others in tundra ecosystems is to scale back and get an understanding of what's going on in the plots and how that relates to what's going on in the landscape as a whole. And at this site, we've been collecting drone data now for 5 years. And so we can build surface models like the one that's shown here. And then we can also collect multispectral data and calculate that normalized difference vegetation index. And then we can compare those drone data to the in situ records that we have. So here I'm animating on the plots, the long-term monitoring plots. And you can see 2 plots where there's sort of lower NDVI, the darker blue color relative to the yellows and the reds, which is the high NDVI part of this landscape. And those 2 plots are in sort of troughs created by the thawing of permafrost. So they have ice wedges underneath them. And we've seen over time in the in situ data that those communities in those plots are becoming more dominated by species that do better in wetter environments. So the change that we're seeing in the plots is mapping onto the change that we're seeing in the landscapes. But we wouldn't necessarily have known without this drone's eye view that they were underlain by ice wedges. So working to compare our drone data to the drone data, or to the data in situ and also to the satellite data, what we're finding is that drones are capturing the temporal variation in greenness in satellite data sets. And so this is another recent study just about to come out in Environmental Research Letters. And you can see in the plot on the left here, the drone NDVI on the x-axis and the satellite NDVI on the y-axis for the MODIS, Sentinel, and Landsat data sets. And there's pretty good correlation between these different data sets. And then on the right side, you can see the sort of trends across the growing season of the increase in greenness, the peak greenness, and then senescence across all those data sets. And we're also finding that the drones are capturing the spatial variation in landscapes. So in these plots, you have the drone data at the top, and then you have the drone data aggregated to a 10-meter pixel on the left at the bottom. In the center, the Sentinel data, and the difference between the drone data and the Sentinel data. And what we're seeing is that the drone data are doing a better job of capturing both the high and the low NDVI parts of the landscape, a better job than the satellite data have achieved. And we've also been looking at spatial statistics with these data sets and trying to understand what the sort of optimum grain size might be to observe the plants themselves and potentially the change going on in these systems. And at our Ecological site, we're finding that spatial variation in greenness peaks at around half a meter. So it could be that our sort of optimal grain size is at half a meter or less in these landscapes. And we're interested in carrying out these kind of analyses at sites around the tundra biome to see how variable that half a meter sort of scale is. And so to get that tundra biome perspective, what we've been doing for the last 3 years is collecting data and compiling data across the tundra biome through the High Latitude Drone Ecology Network. So this is a network set up by Jeff Kirby and myself, and with many data contributors. So I think we're around 50 plus researchers involved in the network at the moment. And we've mapped out with our drones 73 different Arctic landscapes across 18 regions in all of the Arctic nations. So this is many, many drone images compiled together, collected using standardized protocols, and currently being analyzed using standardized approaches. And so it's a really exciting data set to explore some of these questions that I'm bringing up in the talk today at that biome scale. And so these are just some visuals of the multispectral data that we have across the high latitude drone ecology network sites. And so we're really excited about comparing the relatively lush environments that we see on, say, Qikqtarjuaq in the Western Canadian Arctic with the much lower NDVI environments in the high Arctic, and making these comparisons around the tundra biome. And what we're trying to do with these data sets is go from land cover to greenness to biomass ultimately, and to look at those productivity questions across the landscape. But there's challenges at play here because some of these indices, like the normalized difference vegetation index, are not linear. So you've got these sort of saturating relationships, which means that vegetation change doesn't necessarily relate to a very strong signal in NDVI, depending on what vegetation change you're talking about. So if you go from bare ground to a green landscape, that could be quite a dramatic change. But if you go from increased productivity, if the productivity is already relatively high, you could be close to the saturation point of the NDVI and not pick up much change. So with these data sets, what we're working on and hoping to do is compare the greenness of the landscapes, the land cover, and the surface models of elevation, and also sort of estimated biomass models and maps, et cetera, to the greening trends that we see from the satellite data, and try and get a better understanding of why we see greening in some places, browning in other places, and no change in many other places. So we're combining that spatial information with the temporal information to understand greening trends across the Arctic. And I wanted to sort of wrap up with some thoughts about, again, why this greening matters from the sort of biodiversity perspective. So vegetation is the sort of base of the food webs in these, in all systems, but particularly in these Arctic ecosystems. And so changes to tundra vegetation will influence many species. So we have things like reindeer and caribou who depend on the vegetation for food. You have species that are sort of adapted to more southern latitude plant communities who might be able to move northwards into the Arctic as the vegetation shifts. And you have some species that might be sort of excluded from tundra communities as we get this shrubification and other changes that are potentially impacting their food plants and habitat in other ways. And you have things like the pollinators who could be really influenced by the timing of when plants are growing as tundra ecosystems change. So if you take, for example, this Arctic bee species, when plants are flowering within the landscape is really important for when it can carry out its life cycle. And if you have, for example, snow melting out very early in these systems, you could actually get the flowering to not only shift earlier, but also to be more homogeneous across the landscape, because the snow patches that would allow for different parts of the landscape to have different phenological timings in terms of flowering could have melted out earlier. So we have a lot of remaining questions about how plant phenology change might be influencing different trophic levels. And we're hoping that things like drones and time-lapse cameras can help us get at those questions, because up until this point, just relying on satellite data, you get a very homogeneous picture of the change that's actually going on the ground. And what we need to know is, yeah, if there are parts of the landscape where green up is happening sooner versus later when flowering is happening, and how heterogeneous versus homogeneous those signals might be. And then I wanted to sort of end the talk thinking about people and change. So at our Arctic field site, Qikqtarjuaq, this is a place that has a really long and important human history. So it's been the traditional territory of the Inuvialuit people for thousands of years, and there are still a lot of culturally important sites on the island and people using the site to the current day for their traditional activities. And then it was also used by European whalers over 100 years ago as a site to overwinter their whaling boats. And so there are historic buildings at the site that are one of the buildings you can see in the distance there is the oldest building in the Yukon. And then today it's a territorial park and is being visited by park visitors, Inuvialuit people, and researchers like us. So it's a really wonderful place to be privileged enough to get to go to and to conduct our research. And I want to emphasize that it's not just us as scientists who are documenting the change that's going on. Arctic people are both documenting and living through the change that's going on in these systems. And for them, this change directly impacts all elements of their lives. And so I personally feel very privileged to get to work with and collaborate with Northern peoples to understand that change going on and to use different perspectives to document that change. And so I think in summary, taking the whole talk together, the main point I want to convey is that this Arctic greening story of climate warming is leading to vegetation change, is leading to Arctic greening. That simple story is not the real story that's going on out there. We're actually looking at a much more complex signal of a variety of different direct and indirect mechanisms influencing a variety of different elements to vegetation change. And those changes are having important implications for the biodiversity of these landscapes and the interactions between species, and how humans use these landscapes. And all of that is a part of this greening Arctic signal. And it could be those indirect mechanisms that we aren't sort of emphasizing enough at the moment in terms of what's actually driving the change that we're seeing. And so things like permafrost thaw, altering nutrient cycling could be a really important part of the plant composition change signal that maybe we haven't fully recognized as a research community. And of course, ultimately, one of the important questions here is, are we changing the carbon cycle in these systems? And are we going to see faster cycling of carbon moving through this system and a net loss of carbon to the atmosphere? Or will plants trap more carbon in these systems? And I think the sort of current feeling is that we're probably looking at more losses versus gains of carbon in these systems. But exactly how that net balance will work out and what the positive feedbacks of Arctic change will be remain unquantified, I would say. So I hope I've given you a fair bit to think about today. So here's a last view of the Qikiqtarjuaq field site. And this person could be you here sitting on the edge of a retrogressive thaw slump and thinking about change and the implications of change in these Arctic ecosystems. So just to summarize, Arctic ecosystems are greening, but satellite data sets do not entirely agree, and there's variability around the Arctic. Tundra vegetation is increasing, but there's heterogeneity in that signal. Warming is linked with greening, but indirect drivers could play an important role and a mechanistic role. And landscape level data collection across scales can help us understand the drivers and impacts of tundra greening. So what's the road ahead? My belief is that new data and new technology is going to be a key part of how we get a better handle on what's going on in these systems, in parallel with continuing the long-term monitoring that we're doing. And of course, for most of us or many of us, this summer is going to be a gap in our long-term monitoring data sets. And who knows what will happen next summer as well. But I'm excited by the opportunity that not going to the field has provided in terms of compiling data sets and doing more of the data synthesis. But I also can't wait to get back to these Arctic ecosystems, because each time I visit the Qikiqtarjuaq field site, I can see change with my own eyes. And I think it is really important to capture the data sets that document that change for us now in our current understanding, but also to improve projections for the future. And so I'll just finish with some photographs of our team over the years. So the research that I presented to you today is definitely a team effort of many, many people, and credit goes to the entire team and to all of our collaborators. And that was us in 2019, the last time we were in the field. So thanks very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Isla. Now it's the round of applause, but yeah, it's always awkward with Zoom, but yeah. Well, there was a lot. That was quite a comprehensive talk covering many research avenues. So I have some questions, but there are some questions in the chat, so I might read them aloud and you address them. I will start by the first one. This is Maria Dance here at Oxford. Thanks, Isla. You talked about how plant communities are getting taller due to increased plant growth, but also because taller species are doing better. Have the taller species moved northwards or to the plots, or were they maybe present locally before, but maybe not monitored?
Great question. So I think the one answer to that is yes, to both of those. Anne Bjorkman, who led that tundra trait work, and I spent, well, mostly Anne, spent a fair bit of time trying to unpick this for the different sites. And I think slightly different things are going on in different places. So some of the sort of more southern latitude sites, particularly those in mountain regions, I think sometimes what we're seeing are lower elevation species entering into the plots. So they are moving northwards or up slopes, but usually those plants are still not terribly far away from where the plots were located. But you could see that as a sort of invasion into the tundra ecosystems. And then at other sites like our Qikiqtark site, I think most of the species were present locally within the larger species pool, but they are becoming more dominant. So something's changing potentially about how well certain species are doing, and potentially it's a sort of release of plant growth and recruitment, et cetera, because the conditions have improved. So I think there's a mixture of things going on there, and it's probably related to, where these potential species are located within the landscapes. And movement of species northwards is a relatively slow process. So I think a lot of what the change that we see is from the local species pool.
Great. Well, there is I'll skip one and then return to that one. But Sam Cornish is asking you how do thaw slumps cause the if thaw slumps cause detectable browning, and how long does it take for this kind of a slump to green? That could be question one, and then if you can comment on the possible feedbacks between changing vegetation and active layer dynamics.
Okay, so let's see if I can remember them all. So part one of question one was, can you pick up browning from thaw slumps? Absolutely. So at our field site, I forgot to mention this, but the big permafrost thaw slump that we sort of ended the talk with there is 2 kilometers in extent. So you can see it in all of the data sets. And it started getting quite active, I would say, around probably it started around 50 years ago, maybe a bit before that, and then it's been really active over the last 20 to 30 years. So definitely within the time frame of the satellite data sets that we have available. So you can definitely pick up retrogressive thaw slumps and other disturbances, and that's a part of the browning signal, but probably not all of the browning signal. And there's other types of things that could be going on in terms of plant dieback in certain years that would give you sort of a browning event, but maybe not a full browning trend. So due to extreme winter conditions, things like that. And then just potentially changes in productivity, but also things like changes in snow patches is one of the hypotheses that I have, and changes in water cover within these landscapes could create browning signals, even if it's not directly due to plants. So we could delve into a lot of those questions later. So now I'm going to try to remember part 2 of question 1.
Yeah, the other one was, part 2 of question 1 was how long does it take for the greening up to take place after such a landslide?
Yeah, so those retrogressive thaw slumps progress for decades, but eventually they do stabilize. So basically you get enough of the surface soils covering up the really ice-rich parts, and then plants do grow on top of them. So it probably in about 50 years, you can go from a pretty disturbed landscape to a pretty green landscape. And there's a succession of species that come in. So the Senecio that I talked about earlier is one of the early species, and then some of the grasses come in, and then Salix arctica is actually one of the earlier species, and it can really help stabilize because it sends its root networks out. So in 30 to 50 years, that brown disturbed area goes to a pretty verdant green, but then it takes many centuries to go back to sort of a tundra landscape that looks like the undisturbed tundra landscape around. Cool. So then the next part was about active layers, how that could be influencing things. So lots one could talk about here, but we think at our Qikiqtark site that the active layer has doubled since the 1970s. So a pretty dramatic change in the available volume of soil below ground. And that's led to a stabilization of the surface. So the sort of cryoturbation type activity that's used to be quite dominant at that site has slowed down or moved down within the soil profile. So that is potentially another reason why we're seeing a decrease in bare ground at the site and plants establishing. We also think that that deepening of the active layer is releasing nutrients that have been trapped in the permafrost for thousands of years, and the plants are able to exploit that. But it's quite hard to prove definitively that the plants are responding to the changes in active layer and nutrients versus other changes, because all the changes are happening concurrently. And this is another sort of interest of mine, is how we can get to sort of mechanistic understanding from monitoring data and long-term data. And I think one of the ways is by exploiting the spatial variation in responses. So there's parts of the landscape at our site where the active layers are deeper versus shallower. And so perhaps by looking at how vegetation change differs above and below ground across that spatial variation in active layer dynamics, we can help to sort of figure out mechanistically what's going on. So that's a beginning answer to that question. We can discuss that one further.
Actually, there is definitely a lot of debate about land cover changes and how they feed back with permafrost dynamics, and on top of that, how other trophic levels, especially herbivores, are actually playing a part on that. So it's definitely a hot topic. A more general question about the Arctic biome in general, coming from Alejandra Mora, also from the university. She liked the talk a lot, but she would like to know more about the relative importance, potentially functional or at least abundance, of lichens and mosses in the Arctic tundra, since you are dealing so much with vascular plants, but haven't really touched those couple of groups that much.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first message, which is not everyone monitors the non-vasculars at their site, or there's variability in how people monitor. And I'll start with the admission that we do a bad job of getting the lichens down to species level, even at our site, and the mosses. So we are, actually, I'd say the mosses are worse than the lichens. So we're doing okay on the lichen front. So it's a shame, but a lot of us aren't dealing with the non-vasculars to the same level of detail as we are with the vascular plants. And that means it's a little bit of a black box. But many people do the detailed monitoring that's required. And so from the available data sets, so if you look at the ITEX network, some of the sites just drop out because they don't deal with the non-vasculars at all. And then with the remaining sites, yeah, you see this variable signal, so that mosses seem to be declining at some sites, but not all sites. So basically our error around the sort of biome-wide estimates goes up because there's heterogeneity and the data set is a bit smaller. So the general feeling is that when species like the shrubs really start to take over and they start to shade out the entire ecosystem, certain non-vascular species tend to get sort of outcompeted in those environments. So both on the lichen and the moss side of things. But I think there's, yeah, much more work to do on that question, and really trying to get that circumarctic perspective on the non-vascular change, I think is going to be a challenge, because we don't always have the long-term data we would want. That's a start of a question.
Thanks. Yeah, I have never met a lichenologist who's happy about the trends ongoing in the tundra. So probably that kind of tells the story, at least about the trends, right? Yeah. There is another question. And another coming. So one by David Hill. Has there been any quantification of an associated change in soil mesofauna / biodiversity?
In the mesofauna specifically, I don't know. So I'm going to start more generic here. So first of all, there's a lot less below ground research that goes on in Arctic ecosystems, period, than what happens above ground. And one of the reasons for that is it's quite hard to work in the below ground environments in the Arctic because of freeze thaw dynamics. If you try and like install things over time, they just get kicked out of the tundra. Even keeping like long-term monitoring plots located in the same location and like having them be square can be tricky, because your markers are moving around and falling out of the ground and so on. So that's part one of the story, that the below ground is really still very much a black box, and the research that has been done is very geographically biased towards the Toolik Lake Research Station and Abisko, and those are pretty sort of low Arctic sites relative to the whole Arctic biome. Then another sort of big gap, I would say, in tundra ecology is anything to do with invertebrates. So the below ground invertebrates would be an even bigger black box, I think, because they're like both hard to work with and underrepresented in data collection. So the question was, are there biodiversity changes in the macro invertebrates, I believe, is that right? And I would say I don't even think we have the data. There might be some site level data at specific sites, but I think we're really missing that biome level perspective on that change. And at least at our Ecological site, the invertebrates and, well, in particular the insects, they're very diverse, like surprisingly so. And I haven't done anything down to a species level, so I think we are sort of really in need of taxonomists who are willing to work in these challenging to work in environments and get a better handle on how just the sort of biodiversity that's out there, first of all, and then how that biodiversity might be changing.
Good. Yeah, there is some group in Denmark who is really focusing on invertebrates, but not soil invertebrates. So yeah, definitely a gap there in knowledge.
Yeah, one of the cool things that they're doing is using the time-lapse photography, so really rapid time-lapse photography to look at pollinators on flowers. So again, I think one of the sort of potential future things we can be doing is really integrating novel tools to get at some of those questions. And there's potential for doing a lot of, say, meta barcoding work with particularly insects in these systems as well. And I'm not aware of that work going on, at least in a cross-site way, but lots of potential in the future. So for the early career researchers out there, big niche that you could fill.
All right. Well, from some general questions to a very specific one. This comes from Eleanor Thompson, and she has been working with drone data in Svalbard, and she's interested in how you produce your digital surface model, because she tried surface for motion in Svalbard, and it didn't really work very well. So it's rather technical. You can decide whether you want to briefly mention it here, or I can provide you with the contact and you can be more specific. But
I'll give a little answer here. So, so we've been using structure for motion across different Arctic sites, and we have data from Svalbard. And as far as I know, those models are fine. But I think one of the key things is to really think about how you're collecting the data. So really have pretty big overlap between your imagery, so about 70% overlap minimum, and then really think about how you're going to constrain those models. So we always use markers within our imagery, and we're using GNSS systems to get very precise measurements of those markers so that we can constrain the models so that they're sort of relatively good just within the model, and then also compare models across years and over time. And I think some of the new technologies, so there's DGPS is being integrated into drones systems at the moment, but that doesn't really get rid of the need for markers in your drone imagery and things. So to do the drone data collection well is somewhat of a painful experience, because it does mean a lot of troubleshooting and really sort of thinking about detailed data collection protocols. And so if you're interested in reading about how we've been doing it, the High Latitude Drone Ecology Network website has all of our protocols on it. So you could take a read of that, and please do get in touch if you have further follow-up questions. And if you want to know specifics about the High Latitude Drone Ecology Network syntheses, et cetera, you can contact me, but also Jet Kirby, who's sort of running the show there, would be the best point of contact.
Thank you. Yeah, in concrete, she's mentioning the tall graminoids growing in low, relatively low elevation, low points in the landscape will be interpreted as a high surface. But in a way, it is unavoidable, even if you do everything very well. That with a digital surface model, you're going to get the surface of the top of the vegetation, unless you get a LiDAR and deal with the vegetation in a different way.
Yeah,
correct?
And we have a paper about that with shrub canopies, and the point is absolutely true that the grasses are more of a challenge, and maybe one of the issues there is the motion blur from the movement of grasses. So yeah, all sorts of different environmental conditions can mess with your drone models in all sorts of exciting different ways. So whether it's illumination or wind or what have you. So and there's another paper out there that you could find on spectral calibration, which is another element if you're working with multispectral data to some of these questions. So from our groups.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I probably, if there is no more questions, is there any other member of the audience who would like to ask a question?
There's one hand up.
Speak now. Oh, there is a hand up. Oh, I was missing those hands.
Christian has his hand up. been very politely waiting.
Oh, I
I've had
didn't
that
see
for a
it.
very long time, but it's also late, so we can also stop. That's I can ask. I can
No,
ask.
go ahead, please. For some reason, I didn't see your hand. It might be that because I gave away my control.
Yes, it could be that I
No,
own.
I see. No,
Yeah.
no, I wasn't following the constructions, the instructions. I wasn't bothering to write my question down. I had a phenology question. You had this mismatch between your observations and the remote sensing signal. I couldn't see how caused that was, if that mismatch was caused by actually the late snow buildup in autumn, or if it was accurately recording the browning, because oftentimes, if you have a lot of bryophytes, then it stays green until the snow comes. So that your phenology signal might not be true phenology, but just the timing of the snow melt. Is that an explanation for this?
I think that those data are a mixture of those things. So I think there are evergreens and a lot of mosses within that plant community, but it's still not the dominant portion of the landscape are deciduous species that do senesce pretty dramatically in early August. So the snow side of things, I think, is very much, or this is my personal opinion, is very much influencing how these remote sensing indices of growing season length. So the calculations are very heavily influenced by that snow on, snow off element. To do with the curve fitting algorithms and how they work. But I would still expect the NDVI signal to pick up the senescent side of things, and I do think that there's complexity there. And it's one of the things we hope to use the drone data to unpick, because at least the drone data, it's not a spatial resolution issue, because you can see like the individual leaves and you can calculate the NDVI index. And it could be that NDVI is just not capturing senescence at even when it's a deciduous cover to the level at which we can apply curve fitting algorithms and get that sort of understanding of change. So I think that's part of it, and I would be very excited to do some cross-site work here too, because that's just data from one site. So I want to see myself, and so I think teaming up with people on this call and people working around the Arctic and putting the phenocams into the story, I think is another key element to things. So we want the high spatial resolution from the drones, we want the high temporal resolution from the phenocams, and then the in situ records and the satellite records. And I think once we put them all together, we're really going to be able to get to the bottom of that question, and we can parse apart how much is due to the evergreen land cover and how much is due to those curve fitting algorithms and complexities in terms of how do you capture senescence within those landscapes using an index like NDVI.
Sounds good.
Excellent.
Wonderful. Okay.
And I'll just really quickly
ahead.
say that if there were questions that people had that I haven't seen yet, because I might not see everything in the chat, do get in touch. Just email me your questions and I can type back a response if all the questions disappear at the end of this call.
I tried to tackle them on all except for one, which is it was asking if this talk would be recorded. It is recorded, and we will make it available. It will be available. The link will definitely be in the Oxford Polar Forum website and shared to anyone who wants to see it. So in this aspect, this will be made available later on. But having said that, and really, I'm trying now to spot any hand, but tell me, Isla, if you see anyone else? Good. So having said that, I think that we have had quite a nice round of questions, and I would just thank you again for having talked today and having answered to our doubts about tundra greening, and for having given us so many ideas and food for thought. So thanks for coming virtually.
Thanks for having me. Yep. Great to be here.
And for the rest of you, we keep on having. We try to have weekly debates or seminars. Next week, we're going to be discussing the CMIP6 sea ice predictions with a couple of in-the-house researchers. Nevin Foucault at the Environmental Change Institute and Sam Cornish at Earth Sciences will discuss about sea ice predictions made by CMIP6. So stay tuned if you are interested in that. And at the very least, you can see the talks announced in our website or ask me to join the Polar Forum mailing list. All right. So, well, Isla, thank you very much. And thanks to the rest of you for coming, and see you around.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.